recording now. So I guess it's time to say hello, Cloudees, and welcome everyone to yet another Cloudee Lounge virtual meeting. My name is Alex, for those of you who don't know me, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second virtual user group meeting under the Cloudee Lounge umbrella. Now, if you're new to our user group, please know that we call ourselves Cloudees within this community. A Cloudee is a made-up word, obviously, which is meant to represent a cloud enthusiast, a potentially active user too. So somebody who effectively wants to learn and show off or just mingle among fellow cloud architects and developers and DevOps and others whilst having fun at the same time. Our main sponsor is KittyCat Solutions, who covers any financial costs related to running events. And it's probably obviously worth knowing that for a while now, Cloudee Lounge has run as a local community, as a local user group, specifically based in Oradea, Romania. And up until recently, all our meetings were delivered in person in Oradea, and most of them, though not all of them, were delivered in Romanian. Now, throughout the years, we've met, we have learned, we have shared knowledge using events such as the Global Azure Bootcamp, tech summits, launch events, streaming parties, career discussions, the .NET local conference, and many more. However, times do change, and so does our small Transylvanian community, which is why we decided to actually do, on a regular basis, streaming of our meetings. And obviously, because we live in the times that we live in these days, we are going to stream our meetings virtually, and we are going to have our meetings virtually. Which brings me to the present and the future of Cloudee Lounge. Without a doubt, virtual meetings will become, at some point, a norm. But up until then, we will run virtual meetings as a replacement of our in-person events. There's a high chance that once we can resume the in-person meetings in Oradea, we'll also stream them online as well, thus also welcoming more Cloudees to our meetings. That said, we now have the opportunity of welcoming more renowned speakers to share their knowledge and their passion within the cloud community. This reminds me, in fact, we also have a poll where you're welcome to add any additional topics that you'd like to see covered in Cloudee Lounge. So if you want to vote for, say, you want to learn more about serverless or distributed computing or Dapper or OEM or whatever have you, just open up this link, which I will share later in the chat window, and you'll get an opportunity to vote there as well. Today we have Christos with us. Christos is a very good buddy of mine who was eager to help Cloudee Lounge's online presence improve. And I've known Christos for a while now, back in the days when he was a strong .NET developer and an avid community supporter. Christos ignited a lot of the other conferences' keynotes, and you likely have seen him present at Microsoft Build and other major conferences on various .NET and Azure-related topics. Christos will talk to us about service principles and managed identity today. And as always, though, I encourage you to actually take advantage of Christos' presence here, and because he desires to hear from you too. So if you have any feedback which is related to Azure Active Directory, the Microsoft Authentication Library dubbed MCell, or any other identity-related topics, speak up and feel free to use the chat functionality in Microsoft Teams, or simply unmute yourself. Christos, take it away.
Bună Prieten, did I say that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
Good evening, friends. That's the extent of the Romanian. Unfortunately, I can't do the rest of the session in Romanian, but thanks for the welcome and the warm invite. It's fantastic to be here again. And as always, I am a developer at heart, and I like to talk to developers and IT pros and anyone out there that is doing stuff with Microsoft and non-Microsoft technologies, in fact. So if you're using Node, Go, Python, whatever, you're all welcome. I recently moved to Identity, so my focus these days is more around Azure AD and how we can help developers build stuff in the best way possible. So my focus today will be around service principles and managed identity. I know that some people may use that already or have some notion, but I'm trying to dispel some of the myths, what you can and what you cannot do. So hopefully everyone can see my screen. I'm not going to launch the full PowerPoint because I have an ultra wide, so it looks super weird. It also allows me to quickly switch between code and what we are discussing. I'm on GitHub, so I push stuff to GitHub all the time. You can find me at C Matskas, and I'm on Twitter. So if you have any questions about identity or non-identity stuff and you want to reach out, feel free to do so. As I said, I am a program manager, developer evangelist for identity at Microsoft. My goal is to inspire you guys to go and achieve more, to build amazing stuff. And if you have already built stuff and you need some support, we're also here to help you out. I'm also a father and a husband. My wife said I need to say this, open source advocate, and I'm a geek at heart, also a Greek geek. So I come from Greece, which is not as far from Romania as the US, where I currently reside. So I feel closer to you by saying that. What are we going to be discussing today? The main thing is, how do we authenticate to services today? And I will cover some of the things, why it's a pain in the backside, why do we find it challenging to do identity, why many people get it wrong. And then we'll see how managed identities, the Azure managed identities, it used to be called MSI, then we changed the name again. So these days it's Azure managed identity in the usual Microsoft rebranding kind of a manner. And then service principles, which again, they're part of the Azure AD general domain. These are things that you find as objects inside the Azure AD that help you do things. And then we need to understand how we can use them or why we should be using them. And hopefully through demos, you will see these today. Now, who in here is an identity dev pro? Sometimes when I do these sessions in person, I say, how many of you have already implemented your own identity service, or how many of you have done identity before? And some people raise their hand. In fact, I would raise my hand first because I wrote some really crappy code. And the reason why we say that is because of the Dunning-Kruger effect, the notion of that, the cognitive bias that we think that we're better than we should be. So we don't really realize how badly we get things because we don't know how bad we are. Now, not everyone's like that, but I would say first and foremost, I am in that space. So I think I know better than I do. And thankfully, we have all these experts at Microsoft and the community that can help us do things better. And when it comes to identity, I've seen a lot of really bad things. Let me give you a nice example. There's a blog post. I'm going to share the slides and you should be able to get the link. This is somebody that has put some code out there. They wrote a blog post. It has about thousands of views. And this person wrote his own registration, identity registration and login process. There are so many things wrong with that code, but if you search for registering accounts in ASP.NET, this is probably in one of the top 5 results. And I'm probably gonna make this worse by giving you the link so you can go to that. But what we're trying to say here is that this person is actually storing passwords in clear text. So his database is, it doesn't have any security around his passwords. His code in the front end is open to SQL injection. So not only does he not store the information properly, in fact, he's also storing personal information. So he's now under GDPR and PII, personal information stored, all these different problems. What I'm trying to say here is that as a community, we sometimes propagate bad code. Somebody new to identity, somebody new to .NET, for example, will come and look into this blog post and say, oh my God, that's an end-to-end solution. I can actually go and copy paste that. So this is just one of the many examples out there how people get it wrong. Which leads us to this one, right? You feel that you've done something great, you wrote the solution. This nice reference to Lord of the Rings, where you are there thinking, I've got everything sorted and my code is solid, and then the internet goes, hey, he's put this code out there in public, let's go and attack it. Because as soon as you write something, trust me, it's going to happen. People will find a way to attack it, whether it's intranet or extranet or exposed to the world. Security is very hard in general, so trying to get things locked down and do them properly is very important. So today, even when you decide to use Delegate Authentication, Delegate Authentication is using an external identity provider to allow you to authenticate your users and then call into other services. We have Azure Active Directory for internal accounts. So if you are a company that you want your employees to authenticate, then Azure Active Directory is your solution. But there's also Azure Active Directory business to consumer, B2C as we call it. And this is for a company that they sell things and they want users to quickly register their app. So they want somebody to come with Twitter or Facebook or Google and log into the app without having to set up a brand new account. So both these flavors allow you to create Delegate Authentication inside your solution. And then from a developer perspective or for an IT pro perspective, you start from the left. So you have your app, then you go and register this an app inside the Azure Active Directory. you get back a client ID and a secret. Many people use strings. We can also use a certificate if you want to. And then you say, what scopes do you want your app to have? What kind of access do you give your app? And then you get the app registration, which in fact creates a service principal at the back of that. I will explain what that is. And then you come back to your app and say, now I need to configure the settings so my authentication code, my MSAL code, can take that and automatically register and speak to Active Directory. You also have the scenarios where you might have an app that speaks to a database, and you also want to store that information somewhere. In many cases, people will put into a web config or an app settings.json. If you're using Node or Python, you have a config file somewhere there that has this information. And as developers, we try to move fast. We say, like, what's the bare minimum I need to do to get connected? Because right now, all I care about is actually getting my code to speak to the database and pull some information out or store a record, do some CRUD stuff. So we'll stick the username and password, we'll stick the key somewhere inside the code, and then we'll move on to the next one. We say in our mind, you know what, I'll come back and fix it later, but things move on, and eventually you end up pushing that somewhere in production. And I've seen this so many times where code written from 10 years ago still runs fine. Nobody wants to go and touch the code, but you have code littered with hard-coded strings, hard-coded database connections, and it is really bad, especially if you heard recently how many people have stuck things into their GitHub account with secrets and passwords. And there are bots out there that will scan GitHub on a daily basis to see whether you have keys left. Funny story, maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I was rewriting my blog, which was on, it actually uses Ghost. And there's a setting file there to allow you to send emails. The setting file also has what happens if somebody wants to reach out to you. You have an email service that you can configure yourself. So I configured SendGrid and I pushed the code into a public GitHub repo. I totally forgot about it. I woke up the next day and I got a message from SendGrid saying you hit your 30,000 email limit. I was like, oh my God, that's exciting. I went viral overnight. This is amazing. But then again, on that same email, it said there are various reasons why you may have hit that limit. One of them was, did you put your SendGrid key inside a setting file pushed to GitHub, which was what I did the night before. So I've also fell victim to disclosing private keys into public repositories. Thankfully, these days, Azure DevOps and GitHub have tools to protect you from doing that. Visual Studio also has a static analyzer that also looks into your code. And if you have any connection strings, it will actually highlight them as information that you don't want to have into your code and recommend fixing it. But what it's all coming down to, well, all the arrows are pointing into this slide are the secrets. We have API keys, we have connection strings that we need to store somewhere. And the problem with that is that if we store them in the code, anywhere in the code, then they can expose our solution to hackers. There are also other challenges there. So if you are doing this, then it becomes very hard to actually rotate your keys. It's good and standard practice for organizations to rotate their keys, their connection strings, their passwords every so often. If you're not doing it, then I would highly recommend into looking on how you can rotate your keys. Exposure, we've already said that. You stick something into your code, you stick something into a config file, you stick something into a deployment script, and then straight away you expose that to the world if your code is somewhere there in public. Scaling out is hard. The more solutions you write as a developer, the more solutions you create as an organization, then you're going to have more and more of these things littered around. So how do you manage them? It's very hard. And then error-prone code, right? It's easy to stick something in code and then forget about it and then never fix it. And 3 days or 3 months or 3 years down the line, you become public news. We had so many big companies doing it wrong. And even today, I don't want to call names, but there are companies out there, massive companies that will store your passwords in clear text. And when you do a password reset or when you call their customer service, they will actually ask you to say, please provide the second and fourth character of your password. And like, what? You shouldn't have access to this information ever again. Right. So how do we solve the problem of not storing secrets inside our code? So again, using the Lord of the Rings reference, we have MSI. So on the 5th day, you look to the east and MSI comes to the rescue. The managed identities come to the rescue. So what are managed identities? Well, managed identities are an object inside Azure AD that allows you to reach out to certain services on Azure without you having to disclose a key or a connection string or a password. So it handles the service principal secret rotation for you. So you create an MSI, and behind the scenes, we will rotate the keys automatically for you. So even if somebody manages to get access to that specific account, they won't be able to use it for too long. In fact, they won't be able to get the secrets. But the nice thing is that we rotate the keys automatically for you. You don't have to worry about that. It offers a simple abstraction for requesting tokens for services like Key Vault or even your own services if you want to. It works like any other app or service principal for all services, well, sort of. It allows you to assign rights to Azure services via RBAC. So you can say, I want to create a managed identity that has specific permissions, so lock down accounts to specific resources. So a managed identity will only have access to your Key Vault. And then inside that Key Vault, they will only have access to do specific actions, like use a cryptographic key to encrypt, decrypt, or to sign and unsign information, or use a secret to call into your solution. And in fact, I will show you in the demo how you can do that with .NET. It is available for many Azure services. I will share the link later, but the idea is that we started with a very limited amount of services. It was app service, and if I remember correctly, the first one was Key Vault. So your app service in Azure could call into Key Vault with using managed identities. We now have a whole slew of services. We support VMs, we support scale sets, we support Kubernetes, we support storage. And in that link, you can see all the different capabilities. So that means that one service can call into multiple other services without you having to provide the connection string or your storage key. It is exposed as a local endpoint. So in a VM, you can actually log into the VM and then use a URL to go and actually get the token. And it provides end-to-end security. This is probably the biggest benefit of using managed identities. What I love about managed identities is that you can take it from your local development environment all the way to Azure without ever having to disclose your keys, which is fantastic. So if I am developing, let's say, a .NET Core app that needs to speak into Key Vault or needs to speak to a database in Azure, then by using managed identities, all I have to do is just write a little bit of code and then reach out to those services. And as long as those services have that identity provisioned, then I can speak from my development environment directly into Azure, that Azure service, without me having to provide a connection string. So let me show you a scenario. Like next one, I have a couple of scenarios. So MSI scenarios. Don't believe in the docs because we do a lot more than the docs sometimes disclose at the top level. So in docs, you find ARM support and Key Vault, which is the most common scenario and the one I'll be covering today. But we also allow MSI to speak to other services like Office 365 and Graph and SharePoint. But the nice thing is that you can also use MSI for service-to-service communication for your services alone. So you don't have to call an Azure service, for example. It can be an API, a front-end web app calling into a back-end API using MSI as well. So the next one is showing a little bit how that scenario is working. So your app first uses MSI, the managed identity, to call into Azure AD. The Azure AD returns a token back, and then you use that bearer token to go and speak into Key Vault and say, get me the secret or get me the certificate. Very similar scenario for other resources. So for example, your app, again, uses MSI to call into Azure AD. Then Azure AD returns a token to your app alone, nobody else. So your app is exclusively using that managed identity. And then you use the bearer token to go and speak to ARM or Office or Graph. Again, great scenario. You don't have to provide any personal information. And again, for app-to-app communication, again, you use Azure AD with MSI, you get a token back, and then you use the bearer token to go and call into your app. So the demo I want to talk to you about today is using MSI for local development with .NET Core. There are a couple of libraries that you can use inside .NET Core to allow you to do that. So let me stop sharing my PowerPoint and switch to my code. Any questions so far? Please feel free to interrupt me. And I don't know, Alex, if he's monitoring the chat, but if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me. There's no interrupting my flow or whatever. I'm happy to answer any questions.
We don't have any questions in the chat window, and rest assured, I am monitoring it, but I also encourage everyone to unmute themselves if they have any questions. Awesome.
Great. So what I have here is a vanilla, no, not a vanilla, actually. It has a couple of pieces of code here. What I did, I created an Azure web app using Razor Pages. And this game has no authentication, no other code there. But I wanted to be able to pull some information inside a specific page. So I have a Key Vault secrets page that pulls a couple of values from Key Vault. Now, in order for me to be able to do that, I need to add a couple of libraries. We have a couple of dependencies. There are 3 packages out there. One is the Key Vault. So we need to be able to create a Key Vault client that will allow us to retrieve secrets or any other keys that we need from Key Vault itself. But there are a couple of other supporting libraries that we can use to be able to authenticate against the Key Vault without me providing any keys. The first one is the Microsoft Azure Services App Authentication. This is a library that is not just used with Key Vault, but also SQL and storage. And this is the one that does the authentication for us. And next we have the Microsoft Extensions configuration for Azure Key Vault. So when we work with Key Vault, there are 2 options here. One is inside my code. I want to go, for example, and say when I run my page, I want to create a Key Vault client. Let me make this slightly bigger. Let's do 150. So what I have here is, I'm gonna skim through the first bit a little bit. So what I have here is a Key Vault client that uses the authentication service to go and get a token. And then within the next line, what I'm doing is I'm grabbing a secret. So I'm saying to my Key Vault client, go and get me the secret named Key Vault secret, mistyped here with as secret. And I get the value and put into my model. And then in the front end, I use that actually here. So this is code actually calling into Key Vault on demand to get a secret. But there are cases where I mentioned earlier on, you want your code or your application to call into SQL, right? So for me to be able to call into SQL, if I'm using Entity Framework, I'm probably doing something in my startup. So my middleware will go and spin up something and set up the database or set up the connection string, do some setup as well. At this point, I'm not doing it on demand because I already need to have the configuration settings in my page. So if I switch to my app settings, you'll see here, I have this this variable called some config value from Key Vault. This could be my database connection string. This could be anything. And as you can see here, it is actually empty, right? I have a placeholder here and I say, I don't want to populate. I don't want to disclose any sensitive information. What I want to do is I want to use the Azure Key Vault and the configuration library to go and get this at startup. And so far, all you see here is my Key Vault name and nothing else, which it means that I don't have any keys here. So how do I actually communicate with my Key Vault? That's the question. Up here, it's super tiny, but you'll notice that I am signed in into Visual Studio. So when I use the authentication library, it will do some magic checks there to see if I'm already logged into Visual Studio or if I have the Azure CLI, and it will use the managed identity on my log. It's not a managed identity, it's actually an authentication option to take the current token stored on my local machine and go and speak to Azure. So let's see if this is going to work. In fact, this is not going to work because I'm trying to use MSI for some, you know what? No, it should work. Let's run it. I messed up my tags the last time I was doing this one, so I usually iterate through the code and show you the progression, but for this instance, let's run it and see what happens. So what I've done is I've done a little bit of code here. What I am saying is that if I am running in production, if I am running on Azure, then I want to use the managed identity on Azure. But if I'm on my local machine, then I want to use the default token provider. I will cover that in a second. So we have a Key Vault page. In fact, I only set that up so I can show you. So this is the code on demand. This one is the one that says, go and get my Key Vault secret on demand. But this is the config value that comes from my startup. So as I start up my application, I go into Key Vault and pull that information out. So if I switch onto my browser and go into my Key Vault and go into my secrets, you will see I have a couple of variables that match in name to the one I have in code. And these are the values I'm pulling either at startup or on demand. Now, you'll notice I haven't had to do anything with regards to providing any secrets. So how does this work? If I go into my access policies inside my Key Vault, you'll notice that I'm the user here. In fact, I'm an owner of that subscription. And my account, which is the same one as the one I have in Visual Studio, matches. So I have full permissions on my Key Vault to go and pull information out. So this is great, right? My local environment works exactly as expected. Now, I took that exactly the same code and I pushed it into production. So as you can see here, I have a web app that is running the exact same code. So let's launch it, browse to this one. And if I go into Key Vault, boom, it works. So how does my Azure app service work? Remember, on the local machine, I do some defensive programming here because I do not have, I'm not running in production. So what I'm saying here is that I am using my local account. I want to authenticate against Azure, and as long as that matches, then we're good. In production, though, when we're running in Azure, then there are a couple of things that you need to configure. So again, under the Azure app service, there is a tab called Identity. And in here, when you deploy anything to Azure, by default, we will assign the system-assigned managed identity. This means that the app service creates a managed identity that is closely tied together with the resource. This managed identity will go away if I delete my web app, and it will. I will have to recreate it from scratch, and I will need to assign the same permissions to that. But it's easy, right? It's out of the box. I don't have to do anything. It comes with all the right permissions. So the managed identity here, the system assigned managed identity, is also configured inside my Key Vault. So if I go back into my Key Vault and look into my access policies, you will see I have one aptly named CM managed ID demo, which is the same as my website. So the managed identity has exactly the same name as the web app. So where's the web app is up here. That's the name, right? And what I've done here is I went and configured that. So it wasn't here. I went and configured that and said, I want my managed identity that was automatically assigned to my app service to be able to go and get the secrets. That's all I wanted to do. I don't want to give it any other permissions. I don't want it to be able to delete or backup or restore any password. So a very tightly locked account that only has specific permissions. If you are using Key Vault, by the way, to retrieve secrets, then you need two permissions. One is the list and one is the get. If you only do get, then it's not going to work for you. Right, so we have that one. But some people might say, you know what, I like the idea that I have a system assigned identity and it's freaking awesome. It assigns everything, but I don't want to have an identity tied to my resource because first, I might want to reuse an identity, and secondly, I want to make sure that when I delete the resource, the identity doesn't go away. If that is the case, then you can actually switch this off. Let's save this one. Yes. And if I go to, I've already created a user assigned identity. It's very easy to do. No, let's go back to the page. Is it still saving? It should have saved now. It's very easy to do. You can actually launch the Cloud Cell, if you ever used Cloud Cell before, then it's amazing because it comes with all these bells and whistles. It even has a Monaco editor, so a built-in VS Code for you to be able to mess with things. But the reason why I like it is because it comes preloaded with all the Azure tools I need, the Azure CLI, and if you're using the PowerShell, you can do that. So if I do AZ identity list, then you will see that I only have one right now, and this is my identity. It's a type of managed identity, user-assigned identities, you'll see here. So it's not a service principal per se. It does create a service principal, and that's the client ID. That's the one I need here to use. So if I close this one or minimize this one, you'll see I have this one. So now I'm saying I'm not using the system-assigned ID anymore. I'm using the user-assigned identity. And if I go back to my Key Vault, then in my Key Vault, you'll notice I also have my CM assigned identity here. If I delete this one, let's do it live. I want to add a new access policy. So let's go and do this. I say I want to add a secret management, and I want to only be able to, remember, we want to lock it down. We don't want it to give it all the permissions. So get and list. And then here, if we go to identities, then I need to remember what my identity was. We can search for everything. Any service principal here is searchable. Hello, it's still loading. That's what live coding or live demos mean. You're not gonna mess with me now, are you? Come on, Azure, you can do it. Live demos. Patience.
Did you sacrifice a virtual machine in production before you ran?
I did not do the sacrificial lamb there, sacrificial lamb. So yeah, you're right. I did not do that. It's gonna break our demo if we can't add it. But back here, we have everything that we need to do. So the CM user defined ID, and here, this is not playing game. Let's do a refresh. Reload. Let's see what happens. Okay, access policies should load quickly. I had that issue yesterday as well. For some weird reason, it was just playing up a little bit. It's good. Lots of people are using Azure AD, so why not? And Azure in general. So secret management, again, let's do the right permissions here, get and list. And then, oh, there you go. So CM user defined ID. Brilliant. Select this one. Make sure you select this down here, add, and then it's added. So let's go back into our code and fingers crossed it should work. We might need to do a restart. So let's see, let's browse first. Let's see if it works as expected. Boom, done. So again, I have a user-defined identity. And the nice thing is that for user-defined ones, you can have as many as you want. They persist throughout the life cycle of the resource because they're not tied to the resource and they can be tightly locked down. Now, one thing I found as I was coding things was that if you are using the system-assigned ID, then the default constructor for the service token, the one that goes and gets the token from Azure AD to return it back to you, works out of the box. So you don't have to change your code at all. However, if you are using a custom or a user-defined service principal, you need to be specific or explicitly say to the constructor which one you're going to use. That is because, as I said, you can define or you can assign multiple user-assigned identities into your resource. So your web app could be using one service principal to speak to Key Vault, but it could be using a different service, sorry, a different MSI to speak to SQL, and it could be using a different one to speak to your CAS service or your Cosmos DB. If that is the case, then when you try to call into your token provider, you need to say exactly which user-assigned ID you want to use. Otherwise, you're going to be struggling. So what I have here is a parameter that I pass in as a user-assigned ID, which gets populated by my configuration. Now, again, I didn't want to tie my code into a specific one. So if you notice here, I have a user-assigned ID, but it doesn't get populated by my code. But what I've done is in my web app, if I go to my web app, and go into my configuration, I create an entry here. Oh, I did not create entry here, which means that my code is still running with the, see? I should have restarted the website. So I got caught here. So let's do this. Ta-da. I was like, oh, it's working out of the box. I don't have to do anything. Let me minimize that. We need to add a new application setting. And in fact, if we do this one, it will restart our app. Let me remember what it's user assigned ID. Let's go back. User assigned ID. And then in here, we need to pass the value of the client ID, right? So, okay, let's save this one. Now, if we save this, then it will restart our app up in the web app settings. So let's go back here. It should restart and timeout probably for the first couple of seconds as the app restarts. I think it's still using the old key. Oh, that's interesting. Let me, you know what? I want to be explicit. I'm going to restart it just to be on the safe side. We should have gotten a very weird error message when our user assigned ID was not configured in there. Anytime soon. Right, I will let that simmer for a little bit because I want to jump back into our presentation. Any questions about managed identities and how they work?
You know what, I do have one, and I would appreciate to know how this works if you're not using Visual Studio as your development environment, specifically code, and more specifically if you're developing Azure Functions, say, and you're using the function CLI.
So the way that it works right now is if you, there are three fallbacks when it comes to managed identities. So if you are running in production, it will try to look into either a system assigned or a user assigned identity. And if it's not there, it will fail miserably with a horrible error message. When you're developing locally, though, what we do is that the library looks into three different things. One is it's looking into Visual Studio to see if you're logged in. If it's not there, it will look into the Azure CLI. So if you don't have Visual Studio and you're using Visual Studio Code, as long as you have the Azure CLI and you're authenticated with the AZ login, then it creates a local token caching file, and then the library will look into that file to see if it's there. And then there's a third fallback, which I cannot remember what it was. But you know what? I think we can find out if let me see if that started. I think the website has restarted. Let me share my my VM again. So give me a second. Go back to my VM. This is actually running now with a new one. It restarted. So if I go into my Cloudee, I can find the error message. Because it was failing for me. I couldn't work out why the user assigned managed identity was not working. So I was looking into the logs, and in the logs it actually has the exception that shows why your code was not working. So if I go into debug console, I'll use PowerShell. I'll go into the logs and the event log. You can see the exception. So if you're not using App Insights, you should be using App Insights. Then if you need to find the logs that exceptions are thrown, then you can come into here somewhere around here. Oh, there you go. So I think I found it. Is this the one? Nope. There's one that says, I tried 3 times. I tried these 3 different ways to authenticate. I can't remember which one it was. Just a second. So many error messages here. And logs. Invalid status. What was in here? Oh, that was that. Oh. Is it the one? Nope, I will find it. Yeah, so when you're developing, you don't have to actually use Visual Studio. You can be on a Mac, and then as long as you have Azure CLI, for example, then it will work. I can't remember what was the third one. But it does look into 3 different things because remember, locally you don't have a managed identity, right? You just have an authentication token, which fakes the managed identity, so people think that you're using the managed identity. There you go, right? Okay, so it says no connection string, right? So it running locally, it says I am trying to get it and I can't see it. So up here it says I tried to get token using the managed service identity, but I couldn't acquire that. Then I'm going to look into Visual Studio. And there is if you scroll further down, it says there's a file somewhere in your local drive that should contain the actual token. And then it looks into the Azure CLI. And then the Azure CLI will also have a local token cast. So it's like, oh, you haven't used Azure login. So, or in fact, here it says AZ is not recognized. So you don't have Azure CLI installed. So I hope this answers the question. So you don't have to use Visual Studio.
It definitely does. And I really appreciate this, because this actually tells me that even with that fantastic functionality in Visual Studio Code, which is called dev containers, I could effectively have a container emulating the existence of a managed service identity, and for everyone to just clear things up, and managed service identity just an older name of managed identity. So I guess the possibilities are endless because of that. Darren also had a brilliant question in the chat window. For those who are DevOps among us, is it possible to provision identities in ARM templates along the resource, such as say a function or a web API or web app or whatever have you?
I think so, because these things are covered by Graph, right? So everything that you do these days, it's covered by the Graph APIs. And in fact, we added service principals as part of the MS Graph at Build. I haven't tried to do ARM template creation of identities, but it is very easy to do it through the Azure CLI, which is part of Azure DevOps, or you can add it. So you can have a script, either a PowerShell script or an Azure CLI script that creates that identity and assigns permissions to it. If you are going to use the system assigned one, though, you don't have to, because all you have to do is just say on your app service ARM template, I want to create a system assigned identity, and it will do it for you. So if you want to explicitly create one at runtime and assign it, so that will be a user assigned MSI, then I suspect that you either have to call the script first and then grab the information from ARM, or again, not 100% sure. I suspect that you can, but I'm not going to put my hand on fire for that. So I can come back and like people can hit me on Twitter and I can reply to that if you want.
I would imagine so, honestly. Great, thank you.
No problem. Now, I want to quickly switch gears. So we said MSI is brilliant for code. You don't have to share any keys. But what about DevOps, and what about service principals, and what are about app registrations? This was always
more questions in chat as well, Christos.
Oh, there are more questions in the chat. Okay, let me go to the chat and see what the question was. Is it possible to provision identities in ARM templates? We covered that. I don't see any more. I only have the one is it possible to provision identities in ARM templates along with the resource? Again, if you're using system assigned identities, then you can do that through ARM, but it will be tied to the resource. If you want to create a user assigned identity, I'm not sure if ARM allows you to do that. I suspect it can, but again, I will need to double check and get back to you. But that's a great question. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any other question either. Andreas, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself as well.
Yeah.
I just saw it ping, so just heads up. That was all. Sorry. Didn't read
okay. Cool. Thank you. We'll keep an eye. I'll keep an eye on the chat if there are more. Right. App registration, service principals, and getting your head around it, because it's always a bit confusing. So an app registration is something that you need to go into Azure and create yourself in Azure AD. It actually says, I'm going to need some authentication against Azure. So I need to create an app that matches my web app. So if I have a web app in Node and it needs to go into Azure AD, I need to have a one-to-one mapping. So it's used for identity delegation, and we also add access management. So if your app also needs to call into Graph, or it needs to communicate with other APIs, then this is where we assign permissions to the app registration. Service principals are an instance of that app registration. So if you think about the app registration as a class, then the service principal is an instance of that class. You can have multiple instances of the same app registration, either within the same tenant, within your same org. So if you are, like, let's say, company X, Contoso, then your app registration will be one and one alone, but you can have multiple service principals at the back of that. You can also have if you're multi-tenant, so you have X company logging into Contoso, then they can also have a service principal that maps to that globally unique app registration, right? So if you are, that's only if you're creating a multi-tenant app. I don't want to confuse people. Where do we use service principals? Now, by default, if you create an app registration and you go back into your app, you configure your keys, what have you, you're done. You haven't really touched service principals. That's because automatically we will create a service principal at the back of the app registration. So you have a single instance, and that's what you're using in your app. But you can also be super explicit and say, I want to create a service principal based on this app registration that I'm going to be using for automation. What kind of automation scenarios? This is for running PowerShell and CLI. So if you have a task that runs nightly or every so often, you don't want to make it interactive. You want to automatically go and sign in. In that case, I would recommend using a certificate, so you don't have to again store secrets and passwords. As I said, daemon apps, you might have a console app that needs to go and speak into Azure. Again, you want to use the service principal with lockdown permissions. Deployment tasks, I will show you my favorite scenario, which is using service principals inside my Azure DevOps to go and get secrets for my SQL database from Key Vault. Then you have machine learning tasks, run books, and what have you. So in the old days, if you wanted to run something inside your network, you would create a service account, a network or a domain account, which was assigned specific permissions. It could go from one machine to another or one server to another and do magic things. In the space of the cloud or the cloud era, you don't have that one. You can't have an account created on your local VM that goes and speaks to other services on Azure. So to allow you to do that, we provide service principals. So service principals are your service accounts of the future or the now. And then let me see, I want to show you how you can create it. You can use Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell. Here I'm using Azure CLI. The command is Azure AD service principal create for RBAC, and the name is X. In the old days, you were able to also pass a password. So you could say, I want to authenticate with a password or a certificate. Now we don't allow you to do passwords yourselves because we want to protect against weak passwords. So what happens is when you issue that command, you can't pass -- password anymore. We will create the object for you and assign a password. This is a one-time access password. You need to take a note of this one in order to be able to use it. If you lose it, you can reset the password. It means that any task that uses that password needs to be updated. And then that service principal doesn't really have any capabilities right now, right? So it's just an object sitting in Active Directory. But what I want to do is I want to create a service principal account that can actually go and do things in Azure. In this instance, I said it's a contributor to my subscription. This is super big. I shouldn't be doing that. You can actually say -- scope and then scope it to a specific resource group or a specific resource. So maybe you want a service principal that goes and just checks secrets from Key Vault, retrieves the secrets, or you want a service principal that goes into your web app and restarts it every night. You shouldn't be doing that, but I'm just saying you can provide a very specific scope, and that's the beauty of Azure Resource Manager, that any object that you create is now assigned to resources. So without further ado, I want to switch to my Azure DevOps, which I don't think I have open, by the way. So let me quickly come here. DevOps. Let me switch my sharing to my VM. And I want to show you a task that I have already created for that. I have a sign into Azure DevOps. I have a resource deployment task that creates a SQL Server database. Now, for that to happen, when you use ARM, you need to provide explicit information, which is the username and the password for the code. So let's look very quickly into the repo just to show you what I have. I have an ARM template. I have an Azure deploy file. It has some parameters that you need to pass in. One of them is the name of the database. Let me make it slightly bigger so you guys can see, or you friends can see. I need to be gender sensitive. So admin login and admin login password. Back in the old days, we have people that would actually pass them through parameters or will hard code them in there. And that was awful because, again, this is code checked into a repository, which can fall victim to attacks or what have you. So what we need to do actually is to, like in the old days, you would do this. Like, oh my God, you don't do that anymore. So the way that we do it these days, or the way that we do it with service principals, is I say for my admin login and my admin password, I want you to go and look into my key vault. So you notice here I have a key vault, and it points to my specific key vault, and it goes and retrieves a specific secret name, right? If I go back to my key vault again, let's see that very quickly. I have my secrets, and I have secrets that match in name to those ARM parameters. So SQL admin and login password. So how does this work? When you create your pipeline, right? If I come to my pipeline, I come here and then I say, so from an ARM template perspective, that's all you need to do. However, it would not work unless you have the right the right service principal assigned to it, right? You need an identity. So if I go into edit, when you create the first time the task, it creates like, let me just pull this up. Template, you know, says which subscription do you want to use. And in fact, when you do this one, if you don't have a service connection, it goes and creates a service connection. This service connection, in fact, creates a service principal that is automatically assigned to Azure AD. And if you come into your project settings, you will notice that down here I have service connections, and that service connection is called CM internal. If I jump back into my key vault, if I go to my access policies, I came here and I added this is my my connection, my service connection service principal that was automatically generated by Azure DevOps. So Azure DevOps is lovely in that because it has this tight kind of connectivity between your code, your pipelines, and Azure. It brings everything nicely together. You can also do this with GitHub, by the way. So GitHub Actions also support the operation of a service principal doing this. So don't feel restricted that you have to use Azure DevOps. I just love Azure DevOps because it does it so nicely out of the box. So I have my connection here. If I go back into my pipelines and I click on this one, this one, let's go and do an edit. So in fact, what this one is doing is it says use that specific connection string, this one here, and use that specific service principal. Now inside my key vault, I had to come and explicitly say I want this key vault service principal to. So I want the service principal to have access to retrieving the keys and listing the keys, but also you need to check this one, Azure Resource Manager for template deployment. If you don't do this one, even if you assign the permissions to this user, they won't be able to run the deployment because it hasn't been provisioned for that, right? And all I have to do now is just run the task and it will go and create a SQL database for me. In fact, it will do it iteratively and run the job for me. And this is great because it means that I can have a pipeline for QA that uses a different key vault to deploy a different database, and I have a different pipeline with the exact same code, just pointing to a different key vault. Now, if I were to use the same Azure Resource template to deploy to multiple environments, I would parameterize the key vault. So in this instance, we're using the exact same key vault. If we go back to the repo again, I want to show you, we're using the exact same key vault to pull the information. So it wouldn't make any difference whether I'm in QA or production, but this one can be parameterized and pass the parameter depending on where you're running. And that means that development, QA, production are always secured by key vault. Your developers don't really have access to those secrets. You don't need to have access to those secrets. Your IT your IT pros and your IT devs can actually look into Key Vault and manage access. And then if something goes awry or bad, all you have to do is just come here, say, you know what, this service principal has been compromised or what have you, delete it, and you're done. So I love service principals because they can do so many things in terms of automation and securing your apps, especially for DevOps with Key Vault. They're like peanut butter and jelly. That's an American term, which I'm bringing to Europe. And let's go back to deployment. Let's make sure that everything went well and we deployed fine. There you go, just deployed just now. So my SQL database should be out there. If I come here and look into my resources, I just got an email saying, bing, done. So that's my SQL server deployed, all done. So that leaves me 1 minute for questions and anything else you might have. But this is me wrapping up stuff very quickly, switching to my slides which I will share today. Let me just share the slides. I think I have like a summary one that says what we learned today. So the demo here, Azure DevOps with Service Principal and Key Vault. You can replace Azure DevOps with PowerShell. You can replace it with GitHub Actions or whatever you want. Authentication is hard, but we make it easy for you, right? If you are going to authenticate against services, Azure AD is awesome because MSI allows you to have end-to-end security. Service principals are the service accounts in the cloud era. And I would encourage everyone to start using them today, whether you're developing on a Mac or a Windows or a Linux machine, they're all there for you. So thank you very much for listening to me rant about these things. And I hope you enjoyed the session today.
Thank you, Christos. This was amazing. A lot of good stuff here.
Great. And if people feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or email me at christos.matskas@microsoft.com. Always happy to answer questions or help developers and IT pros make the best out of identity in Azure. So open for questions. And again, thank you for your time and thanks for joining me at this late hour. And I appreciate the invite from Alex.
Yeah, thank you, totally. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing all the cool information with us. I find this was very valuable, and thank you for all the energy first and foremost, and then obviously for the great insights. If people have any questions, I think now is still a good time, even though we are a bit of on top of the hour.
Yeah, happy to stay behind if people have questions.
Thank you very much.
Hey, Andreas, thanks for joining, man. I know you're on holiday, so I appreciate the fact that you took time off your holiday to see this one.
I'm actually out in the woods with the kids and the dog, so I'm trying to combine the pleasure and the kids. And pleasure and pleasure, I mean, sorry.
Nice. I wish I could do it walking around. I mean, that would be awesome, right? Take my laptop with me and walk around while I demo this. Unfortunately, it would be too tricky for me, but yeah. Maybe next time we can do it in nature. Like I can go in the garden, do it. Hey, thanks for joining.
Amazing.
Yeah, I know.
Are you in Seattle or?
Yeah, I'm in rainy Seattle today. Unfortunately, the weather is not cooperating, but Seattle is home these days. Okay.
Will you be able to travel to Greece this summer or?
No, man. I'm not getting into a tube with COVID around, right? Also, the whole situation with visa has been very tricky with visas and the U.S. government. So we've been advised to stay put to ensure that we can come back into the country, or lots of people have been stopped from coming back to the country. So I don't want to risk any kind of stuff. So it's fine. It's a staycation this year, which is fine. We have the kids and the wife around, so spending time with them is more valuable, I think, regardless of where you are.
Yeah, true. Just curious. Well, best of luck. It's really windy, so I'm going to mute myself. Thank you once again. Really good.
Yeah, man. Thanks for joining. That was a pleasure.
Take care.
You too.
People are asking about whether the recordings will be available or not, and I just want to stress out and validate and confirm that they will be available. I will share the link over to most likely YouTube. The link will be shared on meetup.com, where everyone has registered in the RSVP. So that will be quite easy for them then to reach out, and they'll have the right link. Okay, so as we wrap things up, I do want to announce that we are going to have another amazing speaker, Stefan Wiggers, a fellow Microsoft Azure MVP, with us in a couple of weeks' time from today, specifically on July 21st, talking about building workflow solutions on Azure and the cloud. And with that, I want to just one more time say thank you to all the Cloudies joining us. Christos, welcome to our user group, and thank you again for all the great insights that you have delivered today.
Thanks for having me once again, and I really appreciate the invite. I feel like I'm part of the Cloudee family now. I love the term, by the way. I hate that you came up with such a great term. So Cloudees, you guys are awesome. Thank you for bearing with me this hour, and everybody have a lovely day and whatever you got planned, and speak soon.
You too.
Thank you. Bye.